in joining, but let's go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us again today for another edition in our Survive and Thrive webinar series. Title somewhat familiar to last week is again, what? A lot has changed over the course of the last week. Things are going to continue to change. Some new questions being asked and certainly some recurring themes. So great to be with you all today. What we're going to talk through by way of agenda, and again, I've hit this message. I'm going to hit it again. There is no one-size-fits-all solution for what is out there. That still holds today, so something to be very careful about. Our goal is really to provide and hope that you walk away with some quick, impactful, and relevant a holistic view of what's going on in the market, what you can do about it, and some actionable takeaways, which we'll talk about when we finish. There's lots of movement still going on, lots of tweaks and guidance that have come out over the last week or so. So again, just being as educated as possible, taking nimble actions. For those of you who don't know, my name is Ryan Weissmuller. I am the president of Intrepid Solutions. So we're a boutique firm that partners with entrepreneurs, helping them deal with the challenges that they face as they grow with their companies. And we have our hands certainly full right now with the different challenges that these economic conditions are creating. So certainly a lot of real world insight that we're able to bring to the table and hopefully share with you that'll be valuable. So going to cover a good bit today, try to make these half-hour sessions very action-packed. I did get some questions in advance, but I would invite you, if you do have questions throughout the course of the webinar, go ahead and use that Q&A box. We'll get to as many as we can. If I'm not able to get to your questions, go ahead and shoot me an email or submit those again in the future, and we'll try to answer as much as we can. But I want to make sure we're able to keep this tight and get through as much content as possible. So first off, as we do, just a quick update on what's going on out there. Some big economic headlines today. GDP plunged 4.8%, so officially broken the chain of the longest growth cycle in U.S. economic history. That was expected, a huge drop. Obviously, the volatility was expected, but I think a couple really important things to bear in mind still with this, and even if you look at it, even the sharpest decline in the S&P 500 that occurred during this pandemic and subsequent economic crisis was really a blip to the drop that occurred in 87, 2001, 2009. So what we've seen is a very sharp, very acute, very quick, sting or pain, but nothing like some of the prolonged cycles we've seen before. It still hurts. It's just that pain is not going to be lingering. And again, if you go back and look at some of the economic charts over time, even when we're on the other side of this economic circumstance, that chart is going to be very stark compared to those past, much more prolonged, much more damaging economic downturns. One important piece as well, and this is something that a lot of economists have been keeping an eye on, consumers are still spending. And that is incredibly important because a lot of the hoarding, while it's still going on in spots, a lot of that hoarding has subsided. So, for businesses who either directly or maybe indirect, one or two, two chains down on the daisy chain, serve a consumer directly, the consumers are buying. Just to give you an idea, again, by frame of reference, consumer spending plunged 3 times as much during the Great Recession as it had if you look what's going on today. So that is meaningful. The consumer's still in a better spot. That continues, and it was really important to see what happened when that initial hoarding wave had subsided a little bit. On the reopening side of things, 21 states have now either reopened in part or announced reopening plans. Arizona, where we are, obviously has announced restarting elective surgeries, and there's some more announcements I believe expected from Governor Ducey this week. Those are certainly positive signs. It is very state by state. So what opens, how it opens, the impact, et cetera. That's still going to be very, very interesting, very much up in the air. And for those of you who love to dive deeper into some of this, I would encourage you look up some of what Mark Cuban has been saying. He's a great champion of entrepreneurs, and he's had some very good insights. He's obviously on the President's Council for Reopening, but just talking about some ideas for businesses on how to best reopen. That's occurring. and we don't know, I'd love to say there's a consistent rhyme or reason to it. Again, very state by state specific. So like everything, just something to keep a very, very close eye on. But the loosening is starting to occur, which is certainly very positive. Another important piece, and something now there's been enough data again to show what's transpiring. The cost of marketing has plummeted, which is an opportunity for a lot of businesses to take advantage of. Opportunity to leverage that. There's a lot of companies that aren't marketing now, unsure of how to market. Even if it's just putting some content together and getting that content out as opposed to pushing direct sales. But marketing costs, and even you look at Google, you look at Facebook, some of what they're seeing, ad spending has gone down. It's cheaper to obtain a lot of that ad space. So something to be looked at, and certainly an opportunity potentially to be leveraged. And then also just the last piece, touching on Main Street, and again, something that we're living and breathing with our client portfolio every day, as well as just other folks we're talking to. Just a little bit of a further update on what's transpiring there. Certainly, by and large, most deal activity is on hold, whether that be buy or sale type scenarios. Bank lending, I would say, for new opportunities is on something of a pause. We don't expect that to be long term, but someone coming to a bank today with a new financing request, given how bombarded they are with the PPP programs and some of the other things that they're working through, it's just slowing the process down. Certainly, I think if the economy continues to open and we do see some improvement, as well as this backlog clear on some of these other financings that have overwhelmed the banks, that will likely loosen soon as well. But just something to be aware of, in that the time it's taking to get deals done is definitely lengthening. And then also, which again, we'll talk about this in a little bit more depth, PPP has become a very popular acronym in the vocabulary out there in our world right now. There's still some challenges and where to go next with that. That's going to continue to be a topic for a bit. So let's again talk about small business relief, and this was an area I'll touch on some of the questions, again, time permitting at the end, but just covering really a few updates and a few key important points. This is where I know a lot of the angst and a lot of the questions have been coming in. So first off, with the PPP, there was, which I'm sure most of you saw, there was an additional level of funding that was approved. An additional $350 billion towards the plan was approved as a part of this last government program. The funding, though, is still lumpy. The SBA site actually crashed on, I believe, Monday. My understanding is it is back up now. There's still a backlog of funding from the original set of applications, as well as new applications in. Questions around how long this money is going to last. Those are all still very much up in the air. And I think, our message relative to that is if you need the money, haven't applied yet, better do it pretty quickly. And the other, again, key to bear in mind with all this, and this is universal, this program is very much bank by bank specific. We have seen now 18 different lenders direct knowledge and actually seen the process, documentation, et cetera, with 18 different banks or lenders relative to the PPP plan. Not one of them was identical. Process, documentation, anything. It was all at least tweaked in some way, shape, or form. So that is something to be aware of. Certainly, I've heard some questions about Chase was one that I fielded a question about. Some of the bigger banks are struggling with this. And our best read, just from knowing the market, it's just hard for those big banks to turn the battleship as quickly to address some of this backlog and some of this overload. Smaller banks have been extremely aggressive. And in fact, there was something on the news yesterday where there was actually a smaller community bank that had done a full year of lending in 2 days. So the community banks seem to be getting very aggressive. The smaller banks are just a little bit more nimble and able to move quickly on the PPP. The other encouraging sign, and this was something that got some flack, and you probably read about it, some companies that maybe shouldn't have gotten PPP money did, the average loan size is coming down, which means that more businesses are getting the funding, a good sign. and more loans are getting done as well. So both of those things, very encouraging signs, and I think a positive trend. My best guess, and there's buzz about it, there's likely to be a round 3 of PPP. We just don't know when, and really need to see how long this second round lasts. And the last piece, and a topic that has come up for so many businesses now that either have been approved or actually gotten funding, is forgiveness. Here's the simple answer, and I've said this about the PPP before, I will say it again. There is no uniform pat answer to any of this. There's been some initial guidance put out, but it's guidance. It's not final guidance. The SBA guidelines are still somewhat high level. Banks, CPA firms, I've seen law firms put out some high level guidance on things. It's not final. And I said it last week, I'll say it again. Anyone who comes to you and tells you this is exactly how you have to do it is wrong. We don't know. And that includes me. We're not telling anybody that because we don't know. So the best guidance we're giving right now is be conservative, be careful. I think we'll know a lot more about it in the next week or two. That's at least what's being discussed, but it is still up in the air. And you even have loans funded in the very, very early days that were funded under slightly different guidelines than loans funded later. This is going to be a very fluid process, and I'm going to be very curious to see where it shakes out. Couple of the other just quick topics, the EIDL loans, the SBA disaster loans. So those received additional funding as well, another $60 billion. And the good news there is they are starting to move. That is starting to loosen. So I know there were some folks that got stuck in the queue, and there actually is, if you go on the SBA site, you can call their help desk and inquire about status. I've actually heard of situations recently where somebody that applied 6 weeks ago hasn't had any movement, but then somebody applied 3 weeks ago and actually making solid progress or getting some feedback, even getting loan docs. Those are being funded. It is moving. It's still erratic, and again, how beneficial that program is going to be and how much you can count on it, still very much up in the air. But at least we're seeing movement, which is positive. Now, one other quick point on SBA, and just something that to be mindful of, and there's been some buzz about this, but the way this last amount of funding was done, the government approved bill here very recently, the $484 billion bill. Bear in mind, PPP and SBA disaster loans both funded through the SBA. There is concern that volume could actually chew up the allocation for just normal everyday SBA loans. So if you are counting on an SBA loan, maybe later this year, maybe there's a new real estate project, maybe there's a business acquisition that's in process, or maybe even a deal already moving along the path. We've got 1 or 2 of those that we're working on. There could be some delays in that. Now, we fully expect that they're going to work to solve that, but there is going to be some impact on traditional SBA funding without question. So just something to be mindful of and be aware as working through things. The other big update since last week is on the Main Street lending program. We were thinking originally we'd have some solid guidance the first part of this week. What has actually transpired is a lot of the banks and lenders are still in negotiations with the Fed and the Treasury because there are aspects of the program that they didn't like. There were concerns that the loan amounts were too high at $1 million minimum, potentially some changes to how the deals are priced. The Treasury has been very consistent in pushing this program. It seems to definitely have a place in the market. This, again, as a reminder, will flow through our banking system, similar to the PPP. At the earliest, I think we're going to have guidance next week and possibly applications this week, but that is something still to keep an eye out for. And no different than the PPP. If we recall, when we first started hearing things about the PPP program, there were some term suggestions that did not end up being what was actually in the final product. So I wouldn't set anything in stone regarding the Main Street lending program. We do think it's going to be a very beneficial program for a lot of businesses. But again, until the dust settles, no reason to get too high or too low on the program, other than we know it's coming and there are active discussions. Not a whole lot has changed on the grants or bridge lending programs. Again, there's a lot of states that are doing specific funding. Arizona, where we are, not one of them. And then also, we are not aware of of any other kind of programs that have been rolled out, any other grants. There's been a lot of talk on things. There is the advance under the EIDL program, but that, just like the EID itself, has had some mixed reviews. So there is eligibility for a $10,000 forgivable grant when applying for the SBA disaster loans. Still certainly a good option if it can be obtained. But again, those have just been very spotty. We know of folks that have applied and either the system were down, funds not available, and there are some limitations. So just things to keep an eye on. And then on the tax side, largely unchanged there as well. I mean, there's tax credits. There's still different things that can be done with net operating losses, some depreciation changes. Like all this, and when I talk about the silver bullet, no one size fits all solution, the thing we're telling everyone is have conversations with your CPA. Understand your unique situation, what makes sense, have a discussion around that. There are some potential changes being talked about. Round 4 of the stimulus package is being discussed. The timing of that, unclear. There are a lot of ideas being thrown out, and some of them involve tax, payroll tax. We'll have to see where the ink is dry, and hopefully next week when we're together again, we might have a little bit more information on that. So let's talk about some quick steps on what to do, and then we'll talk into some really key takeaways and wrap things up overall and move into our Q&A. So first and foremost, and we've been harping on this, are going to continue to. It's all about cash right now. Cash planning, focusing on cash. We're big fans of a rolling 13-week cash flow, and it doesn't have to be overcomplicated as long as you've got the right buckets down on paper. Have an understanding of what's going where and why, and really able to use that as a planning tool. And again, in now this environment where more companies have gotten their PPP funding, where does that play in? And again, going back to what we were talking about, being conservative, with so much uncertainty around specific things that may or may not be forgiven. What we're advising is be conservative. Don't use all the money up front. Because if you use all the money on certain uses and then it's gone and a portion of it's not forgivable, you may have a real problem. If we're able to get, let's say, guidance on forgiveness in the next 2 weeks, makes it much easier to plan. But right now we're operating in a little bit of a black hole. So be very careful with the usage of those PPP funds. Get everything down on paper, review it constantly, because things change. And maybe as things open, there's all of a sudden a new use of capital. We've certainly seen it where expenses can come out of the woodwork, or maybe things that weren't invoiced properly, mistakes. Maybe a receivable that was expected that's all of a sudden delayed longer because even though one state's open, another state's not. And so certain customers aren't able to stay as current on accounts receivable. Your accounts receivable, their accounts payable. Cash is just vitally important right now, and keeping a very close eye on that on a regular basis is one of the most important things that can be done in times like these. As well as understanding what's going on with your customers and your vendors. If there's not a good understanding around that, get it, because that's going to be super important. How are they doing? What are they doing? Is there good regular communication? It's really going to take a partnership on that entire cash cycle, if you will, to get out of this. And so having an understanding of how that affects, various businesses down the line is going to be really, really key. And there are going to be some businesses that I think you'll see roar back fairly quickly. There will be others, even just on how they're getting people back into the office. It's going to be a little bit more measured, which could affect ordering, could affect paying things, could affect distribution of things. So really understanding what is happening with customers and vendors is very, very critical. Getting the right resources in place. And I say the right resources because this is something we've heard some complaints on this over the last, couple of weeks. We talk about that having that team of certainly both internally. Your internal team is hugely critical, and making sure that you're getting good advice, good counsel from them, and good communication both directions. But also externally, CPA, banker, legal, insurance, all the various external stakeholders of the business and partners of the business, making sure that you have the right team in place. We've heard some situations late where, quite frankly, just either some of these providers have gone dark, maybe not providing the right advice. This is not a time when you can do that. So no different, and we've talked about this. Unfortunately, some companies have had to make a decision where maybe they were carrying some C players a little bit too long, and when there's a case where you've got to make some draconian cuts, that's an opportunity to rip that Band-Aid off. I would tell you no different in terms of the external providers of the business. If they're not getting the job done, find ones who can, because you're going to need them today, tomorrow, and next year, certainly. Melting the snowball, we've talked about this one, and I hope you don't get too tired of it, but there are certain themes that we're just going to keep hammering because they're incredibly important. We use this term a lot, melting the snowball. Understanding that deferral that's building, especially as we talk about now opening back up. What is that snowball at the end of this that once companies start coming out into maybe 25% operation, 50% operation, 100% operation? What is that snowball of deferred payments? A lot of companies are working with their landlords. They might be working with their banks. Certainly working with vendors. What does that look like? What's the plan to melt it? Because the last thing you can afford to have happen is get to September 1st and the economy's pretty well reopened again, and you need to go out and purchase inventory, and you've got a whole bunch of people knocking on your door demanding payment, and you can't do both. That's a situation that you can't. It's very hard to deal with that spur of the moment. So better to get out ahead of it, have that plan for melting the snowball so you can actually do something proactively. And then, understanding really the impact of reopening overall. I talked about customers and vendors. What does it look like for the various aspects of each business? What does it look like? We talked about customers and vendors, but following that very carefully. Certain industries, for example, the food business in areas, certainly not restaurants, but food supply, hasn't been terribly affected by this. You look at an industry like aerospace and what reopening, the timelines are going to be very different. The moves that need to be made are going to be very different. So really understanding very carefully in terms of getting team back in place, in terms of making a lot of other moves, what are the impacts and the key factors that need to be discussed and worked through in terms of reopening each business. So with that, I'll leave you with a couple of key takeaways, and then again we'll address some questions. And if any other questions that anyone has, as I indicated, please throw those in the Q&A, and we'll get to as many as we can. Here's what I would say are the big three takeaways for right now. And one is that the health of the supply chain and your customers. That is going to be so critical, because if you can't get product either at all or timely, if you don't have anybody to ship product to at all or timely, any kind of delays in that cycle, especially when you're in a situation where cash might be constrained as is, if it's all of a sudden taking longer to get product and longer to get paid for product, your cash cycle is getting stretched, that can put even more strain on the business. So what is their health? That's something to be looked into now and really plan accordingly. What does it look like for your suppliers to ramp up? A lot of companies right now are even evaluating changes to their supply chain. We're going to see a movement away from China. We've got a couple of clients that are exploring that right now and actually looking at some other production options in Mexico and other places, just because of some of the instability of concerns. So now is a great time to evaluate that health, reach out, be in touch, and make some changes accordingly where needed. The second piece is the 120 and the 360. And what I mean by that, that's days. So really looking at kind of a 4-month plan and then also a full year plan. And these are going to be fluid. They're going to be changing. There's a lot of unknowns obviously out there, but there is some consensus that really the key date to get to and see where we're at is September 1st, which is about 120 days from now. At that time, the PPP money will have effectively run out. We're going to have a much better sense as the economy slowly reopens. Are there hot spots to develop? What do some of those? It'll give enough time to see what happens with some of these supply chains, customers, et cetera. And I think at that 120-day mark, that's at least what we're eyeing right now as a very good reassessment point. So having a plan on how you get to September 1 and what that looks like, and then obviously the next 12 months. Clearly, the vast majority of businesses out there are going to change in some way, shape, or form. What does that look like? And again, while we're waiting for some of these other things to happen, it's a great time right now to try to sit down and plan, work through things, put some things down on paper, and it's not set in stone. There are going to be plans that before the ink's even dry, there's going to be changes. That's okay, but as long as you're pointing towards something. Last week we talked about, the roadmap with detours. That's okay, but at least having a direction where you're going and then being nimble to adjust, which gets us to our last point here on nimble cash management. I mentioned cash is key. We know a bounce back of some kind is coming. And again, there's some good signs overall economically, as well as just, today, for those of you who didn't see it, the market was up quite big because there was some very positive feedback on a treatment that has shown some very good impact on lessening the coronavirus, symptoms, the acuity of the symptoms, and may help slow the disease as well. Things can change very quickly. You need to be nimble as a result of it, and having some nimble cash management techniques. That way, depending on what happens with PPP forgiveness, you can manage to it. Depending on what happens with a supplier and with maybe needing to order some products so that you're able to ship out the door, or if it's a case of liquidating some product quickly to free up cash once things open back up. Having that cash plan, you can be very fluid. And the thing I'll leave you with, and kind of the message is, be prepared to cash flow the rebound. That goes to that 120 plan, but it's going to come at some point. We don't know what it's going to look like, but be prepared to cash flow the rebound, because if you can't, you're going to miss it. So with that, again, we've got a few minutes here. If there's any questions, I'll address a few things, and then if anyone else has anything extra, by all means, chime in. I did try to incorporate some of the questions that we were getting throughout the course of the week. But a couple things that did come up relative to PPP forgiveness, so I'll address these just in one shot. There were some questions around, in some themes, questions around bonuses and questions around certain expenses that applied in the 25%. So, as far as bonus compensation, bonuses in the ordinary course of business, by all expectations, appear to be fine and applicable towards PPP forgiveness. Now, there could be guidance to the contrary, but certainly if people were due bonuses, there's something to be said right now of people really going above and beyond. You still have to bear in mind that cap, the annual compensation can't be above $100,000. But bonuses, by all accounts, reasonable ordinary course of businesses or business bonuses do appear to be just fine and acceptable relative to the PPP. On the other side, in terms of the 25%, and there has been some updated guidance, it's just not 100% clear, that utilities, which includes telephone, internet, water, electricity, etc., there has been some guidance that those are all going to be allowable. And certainly, there are a number of businesses that have multi-locations, so that can be a material expense. The other key piece too is on the interest side. So mortgage interest, we know that's very clear, spell out, that applies. Interest on other loans is unclear. So again, the best answer I'm going to give you there, and where we'll kind of wrap up on that front, is talk to your banker. They're going to know. Banks are actually starting to. I got one just this morning from a bank that we've worked with that are sending a little bit more specific guidance. Get that out there and ask those questions of your banker, because again, with it being bank by bank specific, that's going to be to some extent. I really do think it's going to be up to certain banks based on their discretion, because bear in mind, in the very early going of these loans, there were some things that were approved or not approved that changed. They're going to have a very hard time if they try to take one hard pass at forgiveness as opposed to looking at individual situations. So I do think that's really what's going to occur. The question about PPP, and this is actually another question that popped up before as well, so I'll touch on this one briefly. Another round of PPP. There have certainly been conversations around it. Do we think it's going to happen? Unclear. If there's going to be another round of PPP. I think if things start to reopen, that becomes less and less likely. There was talk of add-on to the PPP program if these government shutdowns really persisted, and maybe another 4 weeks or so of payroll was going to be needed. I think that's my simple advice there is I wouldn't count on it. I think it's possible, but I wouldn't plan on it at this point. And if it does occur, then that's a nice bonus, nice surprise. Question popped up as well about property taxes. Simple answer is there. We don't believe so, but not 100% sure. Now, again, for companies, and this is where some of the lines get a little bit blurry as well, as depends on what kind of lease you have. So again, the tack to take and the best thing with this PPP, keep documentation as best as humanly possible. Track everything. We're telling everyone, try to keep a separate bank account. Don't use the funds, for other uses. I know I had talked to a CEO not long ago who was borrowing from his PPP to solve a short-term cash need and then going to put it back for the forgiveness. It's just fraught with risk. So the best thing I'm going to say on that, and we'll kind of wrap with this, is, plan very conservatively. I'm realistically thinking plan very conservatively into, let's say, the 10th of May. You can always reimburse expenses after the fact before the clock is up on the 8 weeks, but be very, very conservative. Don't use up the money early. And then I think we're going to have some very clear guidance in the next 10 days, 2 weeks, well before that clock is ticking and still with enough time to use those funds, where you're going to know. Because it's the importance of, making the best decision for your business, not just making, there's a lot of people out there, oh, my neighbor went out and did this, sounds like a great idea. It may be a terrible idea. So it's worth asking the question. It's worth exploring. And certainly something to keep a very close eye on. So we're going to be watching things very, very closely again over the next week. We hope you join us next week. We are going to, and we'll send out a reminder, we are going to shift the time just slightly. It's going to move back to 3:30. So you'll get an invite out on that, but we're going to shift these to 3:30 starting next Wednesday. We'll send out certainly a recording of this session as well. Send in your questions if you have them. We're certainly keeping our eyes and ears very closely tuned to everything that's going on out there, and we'll try to do the best job we can to bring information to you for what's relevant on Main Street. So thank you for joining us today. Hope you found it valuable. Stay strong and stay safe out there. Take care.